All right, welcome everybody to our Bradford seminar for today. I'm happy that our speaker, Tim Barzyk, could come. He's coming from North Carolina, works for the Office of Research and Development with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So Tim is a physical scientist, and his work concerns this area of cumulative impacts, which has been gaining a lot of attention from multiple directions. Scientists are interested in modeling to understand risk. Lots of people in indicators are building different sorts of spatial measures to understand sort of the distribution of harms. But communities, frontline communities, are really interested in like, how can you improve conditions in my community now? Yesterday, can you do this? Tim's work is in a bit of a different space. I think trying to understand the constellations of programs and policies and decisions that can be sort of strategically targeted in collaboration with communities. So I'm really excited to hear his talk today. Tim, welcome to Princeton, and you come to the floor.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me here today. Thank you, Chuck and Keeley, for helping me get here today. And really thank you all for spending your precious time here with us today. My name is Tim Barzyk. I'm in the Office of Research and Development at the Environmental Protection Agency. I've worked at the EPA for about going on 2 decades now as a scientist, and my work has always had the word cumulative in it somewhere. Through that time and much self-exploration, I've also discovered that I'm quite the pragmatist. And so I decided to join these two things together and write a paper. So what you'll see today is a presentation that provides an overview of that paper, which has a few additional details. And it is titled A Pragmatic Approach to Cumulative Impacts. Maybe it could be called One Pragmatist's Approach to Cumulative Impacts, Coordinating Decisions to Address Impacts Cumulatively. This disclaimer is very true for today. The views expressed here are my own as the author and do not represent official policies of the EPA. This is very much kind of emerging research findings, and so they don't relate to any official views or policies of the agency. So today I'll cover some questions like, what are cumulative impacts? And then I'll talk about operationalizing cumulative impacts using this new structured ontology that's not designed to address cumulative impacts per se, but rather to address impacts cumulatively, where impacts has a capital I and is in italics. And then I'll present some real-world applications with a bit of an asterisk there that I'll cover when I get there. So just a bit of background, all of my previous efforts have always had a national scope but with a local focus. Working for the US EPA, I get to talk with people across the country, see all different sorts of situations, locations, and circumstances, and get to empathize from a lot of different points of view and perspectives. However, health happens where you live and who you are and based on your personal experiences. So all of these things will translate to a local focus or an individual focus in terms of public health. And throughout my career, I've done data mining and analysis, computer modeling, community science, health impact assessments, and meta-analyses in my exploration of all things cumulative. So in 2011, for example, I found that, even if you look at a range of 14 different indicators across geographic scales for 3 different communities across the country, solutions don't just magically emerge from this type of experimentation. So I found that I could not experiment away cumulative impacts, that they're much more experiential than they are experimental, that they're much more a function of your own personal experiences rather than any subset of measurements we could measure at this time. Speaking of experiments and measurements, 7 years after all these graphs were published, I published a lessons learned paper where one of the lessons was graphs don't make decisions, people do. It only took me 7 years to get to that conclusion from these graphs, but I eventually got there. So what are cumulative impacts? First, what's in a definition? I'd like to consider 2 types of definitions for this work, theoretical and operational. Where theoretical definitions attempt to capture all the possible entities and examples of a given concept while also referencing other theories. So these types of definitions are not easily reducible to a set of observations. For example, for fear, this might be an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that something is dangerous or a threat. In contrast, operational definitions still attempt to model and represent their theoretical counterparts, but with procedures and measures that are tangible and specific enough that you can replicate the work and provide a common frame of reference to develop methods and compare results. So in this case, an operational definition for fear could be a physiologic response characterized by changes in heart rate, galvanic skin response, pupil dilation, and blood pressure. Now, of course, these go hand in hand, but just keep in mind this distinction for now. Because I would argue that currently cumulative impacts has a very similar definition to many of its contemporary counterparts. And I'd also contend that these are mostly theoretical in nature. For example, the cumulative impacts, one of the EPA ORD's documents defines it as the totality of exposures to combinations of chemical and non-chemical stressors and their effects on health, well-being, and quality of life outcomes. Cumulative risk assessment typically deals with a subset of risks and their effect on a particular health outcome. Cumulative effects actually has a long-standing definition for the National Environmental Policy Act that talks more about the incremental impacts of an action. The exposome also encompasses the totality of human exposures and complements the genome. And One Health has a more collaborative type of definition, but it also seeks to achieve optimal health outcomes between people and animals, as well as plants in our environment. So I just kind of use these and similar counterparts as a theoretical definition basis for cumulative impacts in my attempt to operationalize them. So for cumulative impacts, you can really approach cumulative impacts from any different point of view, from housing, nutrition, land use, education. I chose the environmental perspective. It worked out for my career, but the environmental perspective also has a lot going for it. For example, environmental sources produce impacts other than pollution, with issues that cross-cut geographic scales, and there's an existing body of work from which to draw knowledge and examples. I also wanted to maintain a focus on health. So I am seeking measurable changes in public health by addressing cumulative impacts. But human physical and mental health is a function of many different things. So within this work, I did not want to just presume that any given environmentally related action will indeed measurably improve public health in the specific places where people live. These could include studies or actions such as community science air quality sensor studies with high uncertainty, the untargeted development of GIS indexes, where untargeted is the operative word here, national policies that manifest uniquely in each community, or even, for example, permitting decisions of newer facilities in old industrial zones. Now, actions like this might contribute to public health improvements if they're used to inform decisions, if they're used in conjunction with other actions, or if they do indeed interrupt a known causal pathway of harm. Otherwise, I didn't just want to take it for granted that efforts like this will improve health. So speaking of efforts and actions and solutions, I also came up with just sort of this blanket term that I call PPDs. And it stands for programs, policies, and decisions, and actions, and solutions, and initiatives, and any type of decision-making opportunity that can act as a point of intervention. So PPDs is kind of a legacy from health impact assessments, but it's really meant to mean any type of sort of decision-making opportunity that can act as a point of intervention. And you'll see me use the term decisions when you see that, or policy if it fits with the context. So I may use it a bit interchangeably. So from the environmental perspective, and looking at this familiar source to health outcome paradigm, which tracks the creation of a contaminant from a source, its distribution into the ambient environment, subsequent exposure and dose, and eventually perhaps contributing to a health outcome. This paradigm has a number of caveats, including environmental exposure is rarely the sole cause of an adverse health outcome. So it actually provides some fair considerations for cumulative impacts. For example, by interrupting this particular cause and effect pathway, one could conceivably improve health outcomes. And so that, of course, is one of the main goals. Secondly, as mentioned, environmental sources produce more than just pollution, so perhaps this model could be augmented to account for those things. But I did find it difficult to operationalize this cumulatively, perhaps because it's more experimental than it is experiential. It relies on a lot of hard data within each of these nodes, as well as establishing known cause and effect pathways between the nodes. And I found that cumulative impacts is not always so clear-cut. So through several iterations of developing this model, I developed what I call the primary health pathway. And you can see it's fairly similar to the source to health outcome paradigm, but one notable difference here is that I do define the term impact specifically. Because I thought to myself, if I'm going to address cumulative impacts, I should first know what an impact actually is. So here an impact is an effect produced by a source, sort of an effect in terms of like cause effect, an effect produced by a source that could cause health outcomes following exposure to it individually or in combination with other impacts. And for any one of these given nodes, you can collect data to help characterize it. So for the source, you can look at the geographic distribution of sources in a community, or for impact, you can, like air pollution as an impact of a source, you can measure ambient concentrations or use dispersion models to get a better idea of impacts. So here you can collect data to better characterize each one of the nodes, these S, I, E, and O nodes within this primary health pathway. So using that as a basis, let's get back to the question, so what are cumulative impacts? Well, let's address this with a thought experiment, beginning with this initial environment where there's an undeveloped area with no sources of impacts, there's no chemical contamination. But here, if humans are the receptor, there are also no human exposures taking place, so we don't actually have a complete primary pathway to work from. But then 20 years goes by and development begins. This area is separated into adjacent industrial and residential zones. There's no green buffer in between. The facility receives a permit to be constructed and to operate. And this person who happens to work at this facility decides to move into or build a house nearby to be near work. Some of the things in this scenario that we are aware of and understand, we are aware that the facility produces, say, air pollution, might be one of the most visible aspects. And we understand it may be toxic following sufficient exposures, but that's about as far as we go at this stage. There are a number of different decisions associated with this scenario already, including the site placement of the facility in the home, state and local zoning and permitting, national regulations, and arguably even the omission of a green buffer between these two zoned areas. Another 20 years goes by, different person moves into the same house, but we find that even this single source produces many impacts, many effects other than air pollution, such as effluent, noise, light, and blight, and truck traffic, but perhaps even taxable revenue that can translate into goods and services that could improve health, or employment opportunities for trained individuals. So we're aware now that this source is producing all sorts of social, environmental, and economic impacts, but we don't really understand the relative distribution of positive and negative impacts to differentially exposed populations. And then, of course, several other decisions go into this scenario, such as related to transportation and shipping or employment and training opportunities. More time goes by, we keep the house constant, the person can change to someone else moving in who may or may not work nearby. And we see these multiple industrial sources filling in the industrial zone. So now we're faced with a whole new set of combinations and mixes of different impacts, and we can even start to see where certain subsets of impacts might be affecting certain exposed populations, such as truck traffic going down certain roadways and affecting those individuals more than others, or employment going directly to trained individuals who may or may not live nearby. Throughout here, we're unaware really of all the nuances, the total mix of programs, policies, and decisions through time that contributed to the current snapshot of impacts and exposures. But we do understand that governmental, commercial, and personal decisions all played a role in what we see today. And of course, furthermore, there are going to be additional decisions in looking at this scenario. These are all cumulative decisions, you might even say, accumulating over time, such as overall capacity limits or infrastructure planning and development. More time goes by, and we consider now residential sources such as housing, transportation, education, land use, recreation, nutrition, all of those also having their own sets of sources, impacts, exposures, and outcomes. This is not only isolated to environmental sources. And here now, this is what I call a neighborhood of impacts, because this human now who lives here is surrounded by industrial facilities and local truck routes, contaminated land, busy highways, foul odors, rush hour haze. They live in substandard housing. They go to work in the industrial zone while their kid goes to school up the road. They spend their time at a riverside park. They're surrounded by people suffering from asthma, heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. So this is much more experiential. Even though these could be relegated to different types of sources, impacts, exposures, and health outcomes, everything combined here represents that theoretical definition of cumulative impacts to this person. So here we're unaware really of the full complexity of impacts that are affecting this person's health, and we really don't understand how to optimally coordinate across decision makers in order to bring about a measurable improvement in public health outcomes due to this overall complexity. Here now we might actually need certain types of decisions in order to start accounting for this, such as ones that do consider multiple impacts, that look perhaps at incentives over regulation, or that promote a culture of possibility within these areas. As challenged as they are, there are options to move forward out of this type of condition. Now all that fine print can kind of be summed up here, where within a neighborhood of impacts, cumulative impacts are interchangeably both the causes and the effects. So it's everything around me that is affecting my health. Those are all the cumulative impacts that are affecting me, but I am also feeling the cumulative impact of all those things around me. So this becomes a much more experiential and theoretical type of perspective of cumulative impacts. However, there is a flow from S to O. You can take that home. Many of these pathways will exist for this area. There are going to be many different sources and impacts occurring, but let's just start with one primary pathway. Remembering that impacts that they produce, sources produce, can be positive or negative. Now, within each of these subpathways that are connecting the nodes, you can also potentially interrupt this pathway. You can find a point of intervention, and I contend that this is marked by programs, policies, and decisions, that someone has to make a choice to change something in order for this pathway to change from the status quo. A person has to, or an agency or an entity, has to make a decision for change. So I call this the PPD subpathway, or the decision subpathway, that is actually connecting these nodes. And these decisions can span sectors, scales, and stakeholders. That's written a lot in the paper, and I'll tend to say it a lot. But it can include sectors ranging from public, private, government, and academic types of decisions or actions, geographic scales from individual to international, and stakeholders including community residents, health and environmental agencies, national regulators, the commercial industry, and even international health and environmental organizations. So there's a whole range of programs, policies, and decisions that could potentially act as points of intervention. And if you do accept that there are decision-making opportunities within this flow, then we can further characterize those with more specificity, because sources produce impacts which are distributed across different exposed populations who may have a reaction that causes health outcomes. So now the decision types can be better isolated to relate to production or distribution of the impacts or people's reactions to them. So now if you accept that this decision-making opportunity within this pathway, we can move from this neighborhood of impacts where just everything is an impact with a small I to what I call this landscape of decisions, or the decisionscape. So again, in the neighborhood of impacts, everything is an impact. There's no distinguishing between sources, impacts, exposures, and outcomes as defined here. But within the decision-scape, there is a flow. There's a vector from source to outcome. And almost all of these primary pathways have some types of decisions that can alter the status quo. So here, the decision-scape is defined as the programs, policies, and decisions spanning sectors, scales, and stakeholders, representing actionable points of intervention that contribute to improvements in physical and mental public health conditions. And a given community will have its own set of PPDs depending on its sources, impacts, exposures, and health outcomes. And you see that characterized in these images, and moving from a characterization of all these different factors to operationalize them within a decision-making context. So you can still retain all the data and the tools and the models and the cool science and technology we do to characterize things, but they're set within a decision-making framework of which decisions they can actually inform. And I believe that this is a much more operational definition, irrespective of the previous ones. I believe this has a lot of attributes that one could replicate. So let's just take a look at a subset of the model to see how to use it. You do need a complete primary pathway, but it is sufficient to verify each step of the pathway to say that this source produces this impact, period. Distribution of this impact can lead to exposures, period. Following exposure, these health outcomes may occur, period. The primary pathway does not mean that this source causes this outcome. They can have different levels of specificity to be a specific source or a source type, for example. This is not an epidemiological pathway, and the information you use to establish it can be causal or associative weight of evidence to establish the pathway. It goes into more detail in the paper, but let's just keep this as an assumption for now. So even with this level of the model, you can produce figures like this, for example. This is a figure I designed for air pollution, where the idea was to convey that there are many different sources that can contribute to air pollution and lead to a whole range of health outcomes, as well as highlighting some of the points of intervention along the way, such as to mitigate or minimize production of air pollution, to monitor and prevent distribution of it in the ambient environment, or to reduce and treat reactions to air pollution. And of course, you can take any part of this model, like the exposed populations, and expand them to show what types of differentially exposed populations there would be. And then, for example, you can select your population, hold that constant, and then build out the model up and down from there. But this alone has helped me tremendously in terms of just being able to organize all the different facets of information that I tend to encounter within sort of cumulative impact type scenarios and putting it into more of a flow that I can expand and look at from different avenues. However, this still includes metrics and stakeholders to really help target data collection and stakeholder engagement. So you remember for the primary pathway I mentioned, you can collect data on any one of those given nodes. And for any of the given programs, policies, and decisions, there's going to be some decision maker responsible for it. So these things I call, instead of just like data characterization, I call these effectiveness metrics. So these are the indicators and metrics and measurable attributes that do characterize the primary pathway, but they can also be used to quantify the effectiveness of the decisions. So you can look at the data from the beginning, from the source or impact nodes to measure the effectiveness of a decision related to the production of an impact. So with a decision-centric viewpoint, I label these effectiveness metrics as opposed to, say, characterization metrics. And the decision initiator is a person really in charge of the PPD. It's the person who can actually implement a change in the decision itself or how it's performed. So now expanding the model with this type of information, you can just reorganize a sort of what's conventionally done. This is just a draft example from ongoing research related to lead. And I just took information from some state agencies and lead information websites. But then instead of just having a whole list of like lead remediation options or lead mitigation options, I'm able to organize them according to where they really fit into the decision-making process. Who actually would be responsible for implementing these things, and what would I expect to see along the model if they were implemented. And what types of metrics can I use? So some of even the metrics were labeled as actions, but if it's data collection on lead exposures or blood lead levels, that fits more into a data characterization node than it does in a sort of wash your hands action type of node. So you can start to expand the model this way. But we can go further than that because each of these decisions and each level of data and information can have a different geographic scale. There's going to be the geographic scale of implementation, and that's the scale over which the decision is actually implemented, like a national standard or state zoning or enforcement and compliance. And this really corresponds to the decision initiator, like a national agency or a state public health agency. Meanwhile, the geographic scale of effectiveness is actually the scale over which the decision can affect the impacts themselves. And this really corresponds to those effectiveness metrics. So a national regulation, for example, you could take sort of a national average of the air pollution changes, and that could be one scale of effectiveness. But actually, that scale of implementation can have another scale of effectiveness at the community level, for example. Because many national policies are going to manifest uniquely in each of the communities where those national policies are being implemented. Because they can have a whole range of other factors going on. But now that we have the geographic scale within the model, you can look at sort of a whole host of things from all across different geographic scales. So this is an example I'm putting together for wood pellet production facilities, where you can see that there's a whole range of issues and decisions across geographic scales related to these, such as international subsidies, national permitting, state laws, local and community issues related to fugitive dust or reinvestment of resources, or even single site and individual behavior types of decisions. And when you map things out something like this, you can actually bring this into all of your stakeholders, your public communities, your private agencies, your commercial industry, with the same set of issues, and to say, we recognize all these things are going on. Where can we find a mutual area of overlap in which to work? And for each stakeholder, you can then design a more targeted approach, but you don't have to sort of only do one thing with one stakeholder. Further, you can take any of these given issues, start to plug them back into the model, and look for specific points of intervention and specific actions compared to specific data needs that might be needed to start to differentiate between just, say, data collection versus changing conditions through decision making. So that's it. This is the complete version of the DecisionScape conceptual model. The heart of it is really those two pathways, the primary and the sub-pathway. And then the fill in the blanks I offer here are just to do just that. You can fill in the blanks with examples, especially across geographic scales. Now you can use this model as is, like I just demonstrated with those 3 examples, or you can develop it into applications, which I'll talk about in just a second. But some of the advantages of a decision-centric point of view, and I'm offering these from a local viewpoint, like a community viewpoint. I've worked with communities also, like throughout my career, probably began with them. And like I said, health is really a function of where you live and your experiences. So I always take that viewpoint. But for example, with this approach, you can view all the decisions related to a single source. You can view which national decisions affect the most local sources in your community, and then target stakeholder engagement across all geographic scales because you know who the decision initiators are. You can view decisions that address similar impacts across different sources, so you can isolate a subset of impacts, find the sources that are related to those, and then the decisions you would need to alter those conditions. You can target your data collection as an effectiveness metric. So if you are doing a community science sensor study, you can look for decisions where your data might be most influential, or if you have data, you can search for decisions where it might be most influential. Or you can even compare how similar decisions, similar policies are implemented in different locations. So you can look at how different states are implementing national regulations, for example, as a compare and contrast. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool to develop this as like a GIS tool where you can go into a community and search across the different decisions looking for optimal strategies of coordination. Now, we started with just one pathway, but the model can be easily manipulated to account for multiple pathways. For example, these are just some examples. You can look at one source with many impacts. Again, from an environmental perspective, environmental sources produce many things other than just pollution. You could look at many sources producing one impact. In this case, from an environmental perspective, for PM 2.5, there are multiple different sources of that. Or you can look at many sources and many impacts. And this really sort of reflects the everyday lived experience of a given person. And most locations will have an unwieldy number of sources and impacts and exposures and outcomes, but functional subsets can be developed to begin the process. And even within this simplified version, there would be many opportunities for coordination across scales and across different issues. These color-coded ones, for example, if you can see them, basically represent opportunities of overlap and coordination. So moving into some of the real-world, I call them potential real-world style applications. So I have done most of this work as like a prototype or research and development, but what you're seeing here is really, for these next three things, are as developed as they are so far. These are what's in the paper, and I'll be moving forward with these over the next year, or at least some rendition of them. But this first one is called just the worksheet. This is a universal rendition of the decision-scape. You can kind of see the model reflected there. And the point is you can start from anywhere. You can pick any one of these boxes to begin your work and just start branching out from there. So if you're concerned about a source, you can start in a source category. Concerned about children's exposures, you can start in that category. You can look from a data viewpoint from effectiveness metrics. Or if you want to collaborate with a certain decision initiator, you can mark them down and start branching out from there. It's meant to be single-sided, single page. I can't get any more simplified than that. So whether or not folks want to use it is one thing, but the idea was just to have a very standardized type of approach that anyone could just pick up a pencil and start filling in. And I'd argue you want to keep one element fixed across worksheets for comparison and cross-referencing. Because also if you just start filling this in with everything going on, you start to get back into that neighborhood of impacts type of scenario. And the worksheet could proceed, for example, like a health impact assessment. This is one I did in Rockford, Illinois, where you could, for example, preemptively fill out the primary pathway, the source to health outcome pathway, and then work with your collaborators in your team or your community, for example, to then brainstorm on programs, policies, and decisions. So you can use this as a tool for engagement and for convening relevant stakeholders toward a decision-making process. The second tool is what I call the solutions database. So this is a relational database of programs, policies, and decisions where a user can enter it from any perspective or point of view to find feasible and effective solutions for their given scenario. So just for example, absent now is the need to collect air quality measurements prior to searching for air quality solutions. At this point, all a person kind of has to do is decide on the specific attributes for each of the key variables and then conduct a systematic review to start filling it in. And this table is just meant to demonstrate that you can approach this from any different user perspective. So the user can start from sort of any perspective or point of view and still get the feasible actions as the output. Or again, if you have data and you want to search for decisions or vice versa, you can do that, as well as accessing any of the other aspects of the DecisionScape conceptual model within something like this. But you see the user selections are actually fairly simple. And I developed a database like this at one time. I called it a Healthy Environmental Actions Database, or AHEAD, so that I can say get ahead as that double entendre. But this was done with a state university and their community stakeholders where they had already identified some of their primary health issues, and we just scoured the literature to look for what people have done related to those issues as intervention points, and then just organize it in a way that's easily accessible and organizes it into an output report. The third and final tool here is what I call the cool tool. And this would be a GIS application where you can view all the programs, policies, and decisions related to environmental sources. So for example, in the top panel, you see if you zoom all the way into a single source, it'll separate the decisions by geographic scale, and then you can search within that geographic scale for all the decisions related to that specific source. At the same time, that would be the place where you can link to all your data providing tools, all your air quality measurements, your models, your indexes, whatever might be relevant to informing that specific decision now has a place within this approach so that you can target your data collection and stakeholder engagement. And if you look at a community level, you can look at all the different sources in the area, especially if you expand this beyond environmental, and to look for areas to optimize decision overlap across a whole range of sources or impacts or exposed populations. So now with something like the Cool tool, you have a place to put all that fancy research you've done related to sensor air quality measurements or computer modeling or data mining and analysis or stakeholder engagement. Now it has sort of a specific thing that it's intended to inform and ultimately hopefully lead to changes in the status quo. So to wrap up here, the last two slides, we can coordinate decisions to address impacts cumulatively. Structured ontology can really help with that. This has certainly helped me a lot in my work to make sense of when I talk to stakeholders who are concerned about cumulative impacts, but they see their world as a neighborhood of impacts. I am able to sort of categorize what they're talking about in a much more efficient way. And the idea here really is to just begin with what you know and what you do and optimize that first, and then expand systematically across sector scales and stakeholders. And this really is important to acknowledge the role of conveners here, because not everyone is going to be responsible for everything in one of these conceptual models. It's going to range all these different sectors. So whoever is acting in that role of convener is playing a really important part in addressing multiple concerns. Secondly, we can do more to optimally target data collection and stakeholder engagement to informing decisions, because every stakeholder may have a role, but they also have their own boundaries and data requirements, and we need to keep those in mind. And for example, while community-based research is often considered standard practice, in this model of the decision-scape, it promotes strategic engagement over default engagement for communities as well as any other stakeholder. And finally, to maintain patience, but also progress to operationalize cumulative impacts. It took a long time to get to where we are today. It's going to take some time to address these things. But I believe that these methods of coordination and coordinated decision-making are actually more transferable across locations than any specific site case study application that's done at one site. So to conclude, I believe addressing cumulative impacts isn't hard, but it does take hard work. Coordination is a straightforward concept, but it can be very difficult in practice. Stakeholders can have differing priorities and interests. Public confidence is an important component, and historical distrust may be difficult to overcome, whether it's warranted or not. Some stakeholders just don't like each other. And currently, decisions were not really designed to operate cumulatively, but it gets easier. Each time I approach the problem from this standpoint, it gets easier and easier to compartmentalize it and to look for strategic points of intervention. But the answer lies in coordination, addressing impacts cumulatively, rather than trying to tackle the theoretical construct of cumulative impacts all at once. So hopefully an ontological framework can help to accomplish this. And as I mentioned, it's important to remember that not all impacts and health outcomes are due to external sources. Personal decisions still play a large role in that. And organizations and agencies should acknowledge that there is only so much they can do or that they're accountable for. But many of these agencies and organizations across public, private, government, and academic sectors can act as conveners to help bring these things together. They are uniquely suited to act as conveners. Because working together is really the only way to address impacts cumulatively with mutual benefits for all stakeholders. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to take any questions, comments, or critiques at this time. Thank you.
All right, we got some time for Q&A. I'd like to start with questions from students.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm particularly interested in the GIS aspect of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask about indices toward the end and kind of more about a GIS application. And I'm really interested in how you envision. So like, I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly first. So you have a facility and you want to model the benefits of the decision making. So who's actually earning income from this facility being there, who's benefiting, but also the impacts of it, so the pollution burden, all of those items, yes?
So for this framework, for example, you can look at decisions related to this facility that could relate to air quality. They could relate to water quality. They could relate to employment decisions, say training opportunities. You have to be a certain level of training in order to work at this facility. So you can identify each of those different decisions like separately. That's the main part of the tool. Just identify the existing programs, policies, and decisions for that given facility. Again, across sectors and scales, but you identify those decisions.
So is it the decision makers, so where they're, like, is the decision maker cited where the facility is, or are they 200 miles away at corporate headquarters?
It could depend on what the policy related to it is. So if this facility has Clean Air Act regulations, then that would be one of the programs, and that Clean Air Act regulation is going to be enforced by like the US EPA, for example, based on the Clean Air Act law. So that would be like the decision initiator. But the facility, if it did have, say, Clean Air Act regulations, it's also going to be related to like the state implementation plan. So that's another decision, right? It's going to be related to state implementation plans. It's also going to be related to like local permitting. So that's another level of decision making that occurs at a different geographic scale. For each of those decisions inherently will have some type of data requirement, probably. So you get to see what the data they use for that decision is, and then you can sort of ask yourself whether your data, your index, your air quality measurement, your computer model could potentially, be used as leverage within that decision-making framework. So the idea here is not so much to compile or come up with a score or different approach, it's to organize that information to say where it's going to be the most impactful. Yeah.
Would you consider some sort of data transparency metric for this? Because I imagine some data related to this is not subject to these regulations.
Yep.
That they're kept private, but maybe having some sort of rewarding mechanism where if this facility makes this decision public, then it's measured. But then if it's not public, then you say not public or private, or so that people can see that this information isn't available and that's the choice of the private facility.
Yeah. I mean, I think for transparency of the decision making, I think a lot of decisions are going to be fairly available in terms of knowing what they're going to be, and then whether you can put it in the tool or not, I don't know, you might have to get permission for that. But I think like there needs to be transparency in sort of the actual effectiveness metrics in the data itself. So again, for looking at air policies, for example, they're using federal reference measurements. The official monitors that cost $20,000 a piece. They go through multiple calibrations. You have to maintain them and do all these sorts of standards and things like that. And yet communities have access to like these portable air quality sensors that they can go and hook up on their balconies and collect air quality measurements outside. Will those portable sensor technologies, can they be used to inform a national regulation that uses federal reference methods, for example? That's the type of transparency I want to cut through. I want to make it plain to people whether or not an approach like that can ultimately be effective if that's your goal, right? If you have a different goal, you can tailor that. But if you think you're going to collect, local scale air quality measurements and they can directly translate to a national regulation and changing a national regulation, I think you might want to take a closer look at the process involved there. And I think that's what needs to be more transparent, because these actions and these approaches, like the air quality sensor studies, they take time, they take resources, they take a commitment from people to engage with them. And so, you want to make sure that sort of you're getting the most optimal outcome of your efforts, right? And not just sort of, again, kind of assume that a community science air quality sensor study is going to lead to demonstrable changes unless you can more target that work. So that's where I think the transparency needs to come in terms of like applying data and these actions that people are taking toward the outcomes that they actually want to see. Does that make sense? Thanks. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is going to be a very useful tool on the field. I wonder if within the framework it is possible to take into account nonlinear effects compounded from compounded sources, meaning that if you were taking the source and effect separately of these, and taking the sum of the effects, if the sources happen together, then the effect is
So I think a place to begin with that is, some of the most impacted areas, the ones that have all different sources, a lot of different impacts, again, say air, water, soil impacts, as well as socioeconomic impacts. Those areas that have the densest cluster of all those things are also, by nature of this model, going to have the densest cluster of decision making and the most opportunities for change. So one way I would just start to approach that is to look for the most overlap within those areas and to see where whatever I'm doing can influence the most decisions within that area. Now, I understand what you're talking about in terms of, say, multiplicative versus additive effects and different combinations. And I think like that's where if you can start to organize this information and say, look, here's where a lot of things overlap. Here's where these two impact air and water quality and these two socioeconomic variables overlap the most in this area. These are the decisions involved with that. How can I create a cumulative tool to inform all of those decisions that all of those decision makers in concert are willing to accept? Not just one decision maker is willing to accept it and the others are not. But that's where, so it's a little different than coming up with, say, a quantitative type of risk estimate based on, say, additive or multiplicative, synergistic, antagonistic relationships, but looking for the relationships that we know are existing in these areas and those levers for change in the decisions, and then creating sort of cumulative tools to address the most things at once. Yeah, does that make sense? Yes?
A small point of information and then a question. The small point of information is, at one point you said something about a type versus an instance.
Yes.
Philosophers actually have a distinction for this. They use type versus token. So you might say PM 2.5 is a type, but the particular PM 2.5 emitted at this time period from this source is the token instance. So that's maybe helpful.
Cool, I like that. Yeah, thank you.
Type token.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
The question is about the use of the word impact.
Yeah.
It seems to me like it's doing a lot of work and it's kind of unintuitive in some significant ways. So on one slide, for example, you said that both the causes and the effects can fall under impacts as you're using
Right.
the term. And that seems to me both unintuitive is the use of the word impact, but also too coarse-grained to do a lot of important work. So here's a suggestion. You might think that the causes are something like hazards or threats or risks, and the impacts are the results of those when they interact with some vulnerable and exposed system. And so that seems to me both to use the term impact more intuitively. So for instance, if you say the PM 2.5 that's emitted is an impact if there's no one around to develop any sort of respiratory illnesses or what have you as a response. It seems weird to say it's an impact, whereas if it's much more intuitive to say it's an effect.
Right.
So I was wondering if maybe distinguishing that would be helpful. It maybe has an effect on whether you're talking about impacts and exposure. So I wasn't sure exactly how the cause and effect maps onto that part of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I went through a lot of deliberation whether or not to use the term impact. But the term impact does have so many different connotations, depending on who you talk to, that within the model itself, I wanted to give it a specific definition. So I would say in terms of the causes and effects, like here, I'm stating that cumulative impacts, as we know it, as the theoretical definition of cumulative impacts, is both the causes and the effects and everything around us and everything people experience and everything they feel. I've heard that term used interchangeably in all those different ways. And so the impact then, I don't remember, it's right here. Nope, I think it's before. So in this case, when I was thinking about cumulative impacts, I had to kind of isolate what it was that was accumulating into this thing we call cumulative impacts. And so that to me was really the effects of all these sources. So here too, you'll notice I specifically state that a source is an anthropogenic or natural object that produces impacts. So a source in this case can't be like unemployment is causing like detrimental impacts. Employment could be an impact though that a source produces, because a facility is going to hire people and employed people may have better health outcomes. Again, it could be an associative kind of relationship. And so that's why I chose this sort of specific term for impact. But you're right, it can have a sort of variety of connotations and definitions according to the context, the stakeholder you're talking to, or anything else along that lines. But if people wanted to use the decision-scape though, like sort of use this conceptual model, it would be better if we all had sort of the same framework, the same context for when we say the term impact. Now, whether or not that translates to the broader audiences or not is sort of one's own challenge to overcome, or how you communicate that. But in terms of the model itself, I wanted to at least give it a specific definition, and this was the one I came up with, because those sources are producing those impacts. If those impacts didn't exist, then we wouldn't be talking about cumulative impacts at all. If we can stop all these sources from producing these things, then cumulative impacts arguably wouldn't exist, because there's nothing they're producing. There's no effect that they're producing on the population. So that's where there's a distinction between what they're producing versus people exposures and the health outcomes. So I did want to also differentiate between impact being the effect, or the effect, again, that's an interesting question. I might take a second look at this definition. But I did want to differentiate between impacts as these things that are being produced by these sources compared to impact being like the health outcome that people ultimately feel as a result of it. And again, that's just for the model itself. It's not to redefine the word impact.
Just to say, so I think that latter part about the impact on people, that sounds like impacting. Form one sounds like a risk or a threat or a hazard to me.
Yeah. No, it is. Yeah. So you get it. See? No problem.
So we're coming up on time. Maybe we have time for maybe one more quick one.
I see two. I saw your hand first, though.
Yes, thanks. You had a very interesting talk, so thanks so much. I'm curious if you could just expand a little bit on this distinction between strategic stakeholder engagement versus default stakeholder engagement. Provide an example.
Yeah.
For how it's framed.
Yeah, sure. The main thing is first identifying who's in charge of the decision and what their sort of operational boundaries are, if that's a decision you want to inform. So I think that's a pretty obvious stakeholder who you should engage with. If you want to change that decision, you should engage with those decision makers. Ancillary, though, is what other decision makers might be important to engage. I mean, stakeholders, sorry, might be important to engage for that particular decision. So if you're looking to inform, say, a state type of enforcement decision, for example, you want to engage the state regulators, but then who should you engage below that? Now, often in this field of cumulative impacts, and it's sort of a point of, it's more of a point of the conventional nature of the field currently, we will default to community engagement. Now, I believe it's important to keep the community focused. Like I said before, that's where health is happening on the ground. But is community engagement, the actual act of, town hall meetings, public engagement, back and forth, informing the decisions, whether or not that's even allowed within the framework, the decision, is that the most strategic thing you can do to alter the decision? And so I think that the idea here is once you identify the decision initiator, the people in charge of it, the different data and metrics that would be most likely to inform that decision and the sort of process you need to get there, who along the way is going to be most important to help inform that? And I think we just don't want to sort of necessarily default to, because communities, especially in many of these impacted areas, have gone through a lot of research and studies and don't always lead to changes on the ground. So I've engaged with communities multiple times throughout my career, but the question is sort of, should that be a default or should that be more strategic? And then you engage them when it makes the most sense to engage them. There's always going to be opportunities, but we don't just sort of automatically defer to that because a lot of communities too, when you develop some of these cumulative impact tools, and I present a couple of reviews within my paper, that they have seen a lot of tools that do prioritization and characterization, and they don't necessarily move the needle on what's going on the ground. And so, that's just an example where, if I'm developing another prioritization tool, is that something that's going to benefit these stakeholders or not? And so it's just to take a very strategic view on, who you're engaging, when you're engaging them, and why, to basically, again, optimize your resources and not sort of spread yourself too thin or engage people and sort of basically, use their time and resources in ways that are not going to achieve the outcomes that they're looking for. So yeah, does that make sense? So it's really just taking a close look at that, beginning with the decision initiator, but at least identifying that people have different roles in the decision-making process. This ontology is meant to help compartmentalize that so that you can take a more focused look at, say, community engagement or any other type of engagement you're doing. Yeah.
Are you available if someone has some individual questions?
Absolutely.
I'd like y'all to join me one more time in thanking Tim for coming out today.